My son stood over me while blood spread across my kitchen floor and said, "You'll be fine, Dad. Sleep it off." Then he took his wife's hand and walked out for dinner. 10 minutes earlier, Gideon had asked me for $5 million. Now I was 60 years old, dizzy from hitting my head on a stone counter, watching my only son leave without even calling an ambulance. But Gideon didn't understand what he'd just done. For years, I'd protected him from every consequence of his choices. That protection ended before his car reached the end of my driveway. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to Darkness Awakens, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And tell me this, if your own child left you bleeding over money, would you forgive him or finally let him discover what life looked like without you? My name is Corbin Miller. At 7:18 that evening, Gideon walked into my kitchen carrying a laptop while Ainsley, his wife, waited beside him dressed for dinner. He opened a presentation for a cryptocurrency mining company owned by a man named Ellery Vance. 5 million now could become 15 within 2 years, Gideon said. Ellery is giving me one chance to get in early. Then tell Ellery no. Gideon stared at me. You haven't even looked at it. I spent 3 days looking at it. The numbers didn't match. The facility Ellery claimed to operate raised questions, and I wasn't risking $5 million because my son had fallen in love with a presentation. I'm not investing. Ainsley folded her arms. You have $18 million. $5 million won't hurt you. It's still my $5 million. Gideon's expression hardened. I'm your son, which is why I'm telling you this before you lose everything. Walk away. He slammed the laptop shut. You never believe in me. Believing in you doesn't require financing every decision you make. Ainsley stepped closer. We've spent 8 months helping you, and this is how you repay us? By letting you live here without rent? Paying for the cars you drive? Covering expenses you stopped noticing months ago? Gideon snapped. So you've been keeping score? No. But I'm done pretending a gift is something you're entitled to. The kitchen went silent. Ainsley looked at me with open contempt. What are you saving all that money for anyway, Corbin? You're 60. Gideon heard her. He said nothing. That silence told me more than the insult. The answer is no. I turned away. Ainsley grabbed my arm. You like making us beg? Let go. You think your money means you control everyone. I pulled my arm free. It means I control my money. She shoved me. My heel caught the kitchen mat. I fell backward, struck my head against the stone island and hit the floor. The room flashed white. When I could see again, Gideon was standing above me. I touched the back of my head and looked at the blood on my fingers. Gideon, call someone. For a moment, he hesitated. I could see the boy I'd raised somewhere behind his eyes. Then Ainsley picked up her purse. We're going to lose the reservation. Gideon looked at her, then back at me. That was the moment he chose. Dad, you're awake. You'll be fine. Gideon. He moved toward the hallway. Sleep it off. The front door closed behind them. I listened to their car leave while lying exactly where they'd left me. The physical pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing my son had become so certain I would always forgive him that he no longer believed there was anything he could do to lose my protection. When the room stopped spinning, I reached the phone on the lower counter. I didn't call Gideon. I didn't beg him to return. I found Lester Briggs, the one man who knew how much of Gideon's life I had quietly kept standing. He answered on the second ring. Corbin? Lester, I need you to activate what we discussed. His voice immediately changed. Are you hurt? I looked at the blood drying across my hand. Yes. And Gideon? I stared toward the empty doorway. He made his choice. Lester was silent for several seconds. Then he asked one word. Everything? I thought about every bill I'd covered, every mistake I'd fixed, every consequence I'd prevented from reaching my son. Then I looked at the blood on my kitchen floor. Everything. Lester knew exactly why I had finally said everything. 6 months earlier, he'd warned me that generosity without boundaries eventually becomes entitlement. While I waited for him to arrive, I sat against the kitchen cabinet with a towel pressed to my head and thought about how my son had come to believe $5 million was something I owed him. I wasn't born wealthy. I spent 35 years as a telecommunications infrastructure engineer, building networks, managing projects, and investing almost everything I didn't need. By 60, decades of work, property, and careful investments had grown into a little over $18 million. But money was never what made the house feel rich. My wife, Carol, did that. We were married 32 years before cancer took her. After she died, silence became the hardest thing in my life. So when Gideon suggested that he and Ainsley move in for a few months to keep me company, I welcomed them. At first, it felt like family again. We ate together, Gideon helped around the house, Ainsley ran errands. Then temporary favors became permanent habits. Gideon began driving a vehicle I paid for. Their groceries appeared on my cards. Household purchases became personal purchases, and every promise to reimburse me quietly disappeared. 8 months later, they weren't helping me anymore. I was financing their life. Whenever I questioned an expense, Gideon had the same answer. "We're family, Dad." I kept accepting it because after losing Carol, conflict felt worse than writing another check. What Gideon never understood was that grief hadn't made me careless. 2 years before Carol died, she and I had sat with Lester and protected the assets we'd spent our lives building. The house, major investments, and other holdings were structured so no relative could simply take control if I became sick, vulnerable, or pressured. Carol had squeezed my hand that day and said, "We can love our son without giving him the keys to everything." I thought she was worrying too much. Then Ainsley started asking why Gideon wasn't a co-signer on my accounts. She called it preparation for an emergency. Gideon began asking how the house was titled, where investment documents were stored, and what would happen if something happened to me. I never accused them of anything. I simply called Lester and made sure the protections remained intact. That was the part Gideon didn't know. He knew his father had $18 million. He didn't know that access to it depended entirely on my consent. And until tonight, I had given him so much that he'd stopped imagining I might ever say no. $5 million changed that. The moment I refused, Ainsley shoved me. The moment I hit the floor, Gideon had a choice. He could help his father or protect the life he'd built around my money. He chose dinner. Headlights suddenly swept across the kitchen windows. Lester's vehicle stopped outside, and seconds later I heard the emergency key turning in the front door. He entered with 2 medical professionals behind him. Then he saw the blood beside me. His expression hardened. "Corbin, are you sure about what you told me?" I thought about Carol's warning, 8 months of excuses, and Gideon looking directly at my bleeding head before saying, "Sleep it off." I nodded. "No more exceptions." Lester held my gaze. "Even for your son?" For the first time in Gideon's life, the answer came without guilt. "Especially for my son." Lester didn't waste another second. While one medic cleaned the cut behind my ear and checked my pupils, the other took my blood pressure and examined the swelling along my skull. "You need imaging tonight," she said. "A head injury isn't something we guess about." I agreed, but before we left, Lester sat across from me with his tablet open. "I need clear instructions, Corbin. Not angry instructions. Clear ones." I understood. This wasn't revenge for what happened in the kitchen. It was the end of privileges Gideon had mistaken for rights. "Start with every card connected to my accounts," Lester typed. "Authorized user cards? Remove them. Vehicles?" Gideon drove a Tesla, titled and insured in my name. Ainsley used an SUV whose lease I paid. "Revoke their access. Don't touch anything they legally own." Lester nodded. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't taking their property. I was taking mine back. Next came the house. Their smart home profiles, garage credentials, and temporary access permissions all existed under my account. "Disable them," I said, "and prepare formal notice regarding their occupancy. Everything by the book." Lester looked up. "Once we start, Gideon will know." That's the point. For years, my son had never needed to know which parts of his lifestyle belonged to him, because I always covered the difference. Tonight, he was going to find out. Lester made the calls while the medics prepared to take me for imaging. There was no dramatic button labeled revenge, just ordinary systems responding to ordinary instructions from the person who actually owned the accounts. At 8:41 p.m., the first authorized card was suspended. At 8:47, the second followed. Vehicle access was removed shortly afterward. I pictured Gideon across town, probably telling Ainsley I'd calm down by morning. He'd seen me angry before. What he'd never seen was me stop rescuing him. At the restaurant, they apparently noticed nothing at first. I learned the details later from the transaction alerts. They ordered champagne, appetizers, and a bottle of wine, expensive enough to cover some families' groceries for a month. They were dining with Ellery Vance and 2 prospective investors. Still celebrating the $5 million deal, Gideon apparently believed he could force me to reconsider. At 10:16 p.m., my phone displayed an attempted charge. $3,214.67. Declined. 30 seconds later, another card was tried. Declined. Then a third. Declined. I showed the screen to Lester from the passenger seat as we headed toward the medical center. 3 attempts, he said. They're figuring it out. My phone rang almost immediately. Gideon. I watched it ring until voicemail picked up. He called again. Then Ainsley. Then Gideon, a third time. I answered that one. Dad, what's wrong with the cards? No apology. No question about my head. Just the cards. Nothing's wrong with them. They're all being declined. I know. Silence. Then his voice dropped. You did this because of what happened? I did this because they're my accounts. Ainsley shouted something in the background. Gideon lowered his voice. We're sitting here with investors. Fix it now, and we'll talk when we get home. Even then, he thought he was negotiating from the old world, the one where embarrassment was enough to make his father reach for a wallet. Pay your own bill, Gideon. Dad, I ended the call. Less than a minute later, another alert appeared. Same restaurant, same amount, another failed attempt. Lester glanced at me. How does it feel? I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. Like something I should have done a long time ago. My phone lit up again with Gideon's name, but I turned it face down. Somewhere across town, my son was standing beside a $3,200 dinner bill, and discovering the first truth I'd hidden from him for years. Having access to my money had never meant it belonged to him. At 12:53 a.m., Gideon and Ainsley finally returned to my house in an Uber. By then, the scan had shown no skull fracture or internal bleeding, and Lester had driven me home with 6 stitches behind my ear and strict instructions to rest. I was sitting in my study when the driveway camera sent an alert. Gideon climbed out first, still wearing the jacket he'd chosen for dinner. Ainsley followed, furious, carrying her heels in one hand. Their Tesla was still parked at the restaurant because Gideon's digital key no longer worked. He punched the garage code. Nothing happened. He tried again. Access denied. Ainsley shoved past him and entered her own code. Same result. Gideon immediately called me. I let it ring. He tried the front door next, placing his thumb against the smart lock. The screen flashed red. Access revoked. Dad, he shouted. Open the door. I remained inside. Ainsley pounded hard enough to wake half the street. Corbin, this is insane. I activated the intercom. Stop hitting the door. Gideon looked directly at the camera. His anger briefly disappeared when he saw the bandage around my head on the intercom screen. Dad, let us in. We'll talk. We already talked. You can't lock us out. We live here. You stay here because I allowed it. Ainsley pushed toward the camera. Our belongings are inside. Essential items are in the side storage room. Lester supervised the packing. Anything else will be handled through the proper process. Gideon stared at the speaker. You packed our things? Enough for tonight. Because of one argument? I almost laughed. Even now, he was reducing what happened to an argument. You watched your wife shove me into a stone counter. You saw blood. Then you left. Ainsley didn't mean for you to fall. And you didn't mean to call an ambulance either. He went silent. Ainsley didn't. You can't do this to family. You seemed comfortable with what family meant 3 hours ago. Gideon stepped closer to the intercom. Dad, I know you're angry. Let us sleep here tonight, and we'll fix this tomorrow. There it was again, the assumption that time would restore everything. It always had before. He would apologize just enough I'd remember he was my son, and eventually the cards, cars, and money would return. No, I said. His expression changed. What do you mean, no? I mean tonight you find somewhere else to stay. Where? You're 34, Gideon. That's yours to figure out. Ainsley swore at me and demanded the SUV keys. The SUV is leased and paid for by me, I said. You no longer have permission to use it. She looked at Gideon. Do something. Gideon hit the intercom button again. You're punishing us. No. Punishment would be taking something that belongs to you. I'm simply stopping you from using things that belong to me. That sentence silenced him. He looked toward the garage, then the house, as though seeing both clearly for the first time. For years, access had felt so permanent that he'd confused it with ownership. Lester had placed 2 overnight bags in the storage room beside the garage. Gideon retrieved them without speaking. Ainsley refused to carry hers. Where are we supposed to go? She demanded. I didn't answer. Gideon looked back at the camera. Dad, please. It was the first time that night he'd used the word without anger. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to wait at the window for me to come home from work. My hand hovered over the unlock control. Then I remembered lying on the kitchen floor asking him to call someone. Sleep it off, Dad. I lowered my hand. Good night, Gideon. I switched off the intercom. Through the camera, I watched him stand beneath the porch light while Ainsley argued beside him. Eventually, another rideshare arrived. As they climbed inside, Gideon looked back at the house one final time. The expression on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief. For the first time in his adult life, his father's no had stayed no. By 9 the next morning, Ainsley had decided that if she couldn't control my house, she would control the story. She posted a video from a hotel room with red eyes and no makeup, telling more than 500,000 followers that her grieving father-in-law had suffered a frightening emotional episode and thrown his own son and daughter-in-law onto the street in the middle of the night. She never mentioned the $5 million. She never mentioned the shove. And she certainly never mentioned leaving me bleeding on the kitchen floor. Within an hour, thousands of people were calling me cruel, unstable, and abusive. Gideon texted me one sentence. You should have just let us back in. I showed the video to Lester. Do we respond? He asked. Not with words. My house had security cameras in the common areas after several expensive tools disappeared the previous year. One camera faced the kitchen entrance. It had captured 47 seconds that Ainsley apparently forgot existed. Lester opened the footage. There was Gideon demanding the investment. There was Ainsley grabbing my arm, then the shove. My body struck the island and disappeared from view. The final seconds showed Gideon looking down at me while Ainsley picked up her purse. His voice was perfectly clear. You'll be fine, Dad. Sleep it off. Lester watched it twice. This changes things. Preserve the original. We made copies with the timestamp intact and documented the file before doing anything else. I wasn't interested in fighting Ainsley on social media, but several companies paid her to sell an image built around family, wellness, and trust. Lester contacted their representatives privately and provided the unedited footage along with her public accusations. Then we waited. At 11:42 a.m., the first sponsored post disappeared from Ainsley's page. 20 minutes later, another vanished. By early afternoon, 2 brands announced they were reviewing their relationship with her. A third suspended an upcoming campaign. Her crying video was still online, but the comments underneath it were changing. She called me 17 times. I answered none of them. Then Gideon called. Dad, what did you send people? The truth. You're destroying her career. I didn't shove anyone. You could have kept this private. I looked at the stitches reflected in my study window. She made it public. He had no answer. At 3:06, another name appeared on my phone. Sandra Green, Ainsley's mother. I expected anger. Instead, she sounded shaken. Corbin, I saw the kitchen video. I said nothing. Is that really what happened? The camera wasn't edited. Sandra went quiet. Then she whispered, Ainsley told me you attacked her first. You saw what happened. Another silence. I need to speak to my daughter. Before hanging up, she added, I'm sorry you were left there. That apology from Ainsley's mother hurt more than I expected, because my own son still hadn't offered one. By evening, Ainsley's polished online world was cracking faster than she could repair it. She uploaded another video claiming the footage lacked context, then deleted it 23 minutes later. A fourth sponsor paused its contract. But I felt no victory watching the numbers fall. Ainsley had built her image by deciding which parts of reality people were allowed to see. 47 unedited seconds had taken that power away. Shortly before midnight, Lester called. "Corbin, there's something else. Gideon is still trying to raise money for Ellery Vance." I sat forward. "After everything?" "He contacted 2 private lenders this afternoon, and he's apparently planning to meet Ellery tomorrow." I thought back to the presentation Gideon had shown me and the facility whose numbers had never made sense. Losing access to my $5 million hadn't convinced my son the deal was bad. It had only made him desperate to prove me wrong. "Send me everything we have on Ellery," I said. Lester paused. "You think it's worse than a bad investment?" I looked at the notes I'd made 3 days before Gideon ever asked me for the money. "I think Gideon is about to discover why I refused to give him $5 million in the first place." By 8 the next morning, Lester had sent me everything we could legally verify about Ellery Vance. The deeper I looked, the less his $5 million opportunity resembled a business. Ellery claimed his company operated hundreds of cryptocurrency mining machines from a facility outside town, but the address led to an old warehouse whose electrical service couldn't support even a fraction of the equipment shown in Gideon's presentation. I found no permits for the upgrades Ellery claimed he'd completed, and several photographs on his investor deck appeared to come from facilities that weren't his. I called Lester. "Gideon isn't investing in a mining operation. He's investing in a story. Can we stop him?" "No. He's 34. That was the hardest part of changing how I treated my son. I could warn him. I could refuse to finance him. I could not keep saving him from every decision he insisted on making. We forwarded the verifiable property and permitting concerns to Marcus Webb, a fire marshal Lester knew professionally. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing invented. Just an address, the claimed equipment load, and questions about whether the building had been approved for that use. Marcus called back later. "If they're operating what they claim, we need to inspect that property." Meanwhile, Lester found something else. Online complaints from investors who said Ellery had taken deposits for previous ventures that never became operational. I didn't contact them to organize anything against him. I simply passed along public information showing where Ellery was currently operating. At 2:30 that afternoon, Gideon's car appeared on traffic footage near the industrial district. Lester called. "He's going to the warehouse. How much does he have?" "Looks like he's scraped together nearly everything liquid he still controls." I closed my eyes. Gideon was about to risk what remained, because admitting I had been right would hurt more than losing money. When he arrived, Ellery was already there. So were Marcus and another inspector. 2 former investors had also shown up after learning the address. Gideon called me 23 minutes later. "Dad, what did you do?" "Nothing to your money. There are inspectors here." "Then Ellery should show them the operation. You reported him." "I reported questions about a building." Gideon lowered his voice. "You want this to fail because then you get to say I needed you." "No. I wanted you to investigate before giving him money." In the background, I heard shouting. Gideon suddenly said, "Wait." Then the line remained open as another voice rose nearby. "Ellery. This isn't my investment." Gideon brought the capital. "He's the primary investor." Gideon snapped. "What are you talking about?" "You said you were financing expansion. You told me the equipment was already operating." Their partnership lasted exactly as long as Ellery believed Gideon still had money. The moment officials began asking questions, he started rewriting the relationship. Gideon forgot to disconnect the call. I heard Marcus asking where the operational machines were. Ellery claimed equipment had been relocated. One of the former investors shouted that he'd heard the same explanation 18 months earlier. Then Gideon finally returned to the phone. His voice had changed. "Dad, the warehouse is almost empty." "I didn't say, I told you so. Don't sign anything. Don't transfer another dollar. Cooperate with whoever is investigating. Some of my money is already in an account connected to this. Then tell them exactly when and why you sent it. By evening, the remaining funds connected to the disputed transaction were being held pending review rather than released as Gideon expected." Ellery was blaming him. The promised mining operation wasn't visible, and the $5 million opportunity that had started the fight in my kitchen was collapsing under basic questions. Gideon called once more. "Can you get my money back?" There it was, the question he'd asked me in different forms his entire adult life. "Dad, can you fix this?" I looked at the bandage reflected in the window. "No, Gideon, you know people. You can help. I'll give you Lester's number so you can find proper legal advice. That's all." Silence. "You're really going to let me lose everything?" "No," I said. "For the first time, I'm going to let you deal with something you chose." Then I ended the call. Gideon had spent years believing my money existed to erase his mistakes. Now, the $5 million he'd demanded from me was gone from the equation, his own money was tied up, and Ellery had turned on him the moment trouble arrived. But Gideon still hadn't learned the lesson. He was about to spend money he no longer had, trying to convince everyone that nothing had changed. 3 days after the warehouse collapsed around him, Gideon did what he'd always done when reality became uncomfortable. He spent money to make himself look successful. Instead of cutting expenses or dealing with the funds tied up in Ellery's investigation, he arranged a private dinner at the country club for 6 potential investors. Lester heard about it through a banker, reviewing Gideon's accounts. "He's trying to raise money again," he told me. "For Ellery? No. Gideon's calling it his own investment group now." I wasn't surprised. My son had spent years confusing appearance with stability. As long as he arrived in the right car, wore the right watch, and ordered the right wine, people assumed he was doing well. What they didn't know was how much of that image had quietly been paid for by me. That afternoon, Gideon's bank began reviewing the credit lines connected to accounts whose balances had fallen sharply after the Ellery transaction. I didn't ask anyone to freeze money that belonged to him. I simply confirmed that I would no longer guarantee, secure, or support any obligation in Gideon's name. Without me behind him, his financial picture looked very different. At 7 that evening, he arrived at the club determined to prove otherwise. He ordered expensive wine, steaks, and appetizers for the table. He talked about future acquisitions and described the warehouse disaster as a temporary disagreement with a former partner. For 2 hours, Gideon performed the life he used to have. Then the check arrived, $8,530. He handed the server a card, declined. He tried another, declined. The third card triggered a request to contact the issuer. One of the guests offered an uncomfortable laugh. Gideon blamed a fraud alert and called the bank from the table. The answer wasn't what he expected. His available credit had been reduced during review, and without the financial backing he'd previously relied on, the charge couldn't be approved. Gideon called me immediately. "Dad, I need you to authorize one payment." "No, it's $8,000. "I'll pay you back tomorrow." "Then pay it tomorrow with your own money." His voice dropped. "I'm sitting here with people I need. Then they should probably see the truth before investing with you." "You're humiliating me." "I'm at home." "Gideon." Silence. "You did this. I stopped doing things for you. There's a difference." He hung up. According to Lester, one guest eventually covered part of the bill while Gideon transferred what cash he could access. The dinner ended quickly after that. 2 potential investors left without shaking his hand. Another canceled a meeting scheduled for the following morning. By midnight, Gideon's new investment group had lost most of the interest he'd spent weeks building. The next day he came to my gate, but he didn't ask to enter. He stood outside and called me. "Do you know what people are saying about me?" "No. They think I'm broke." I waited. "Are you?" He didn't answer. That silence was more truthful than anything he'd said in weeks. "Dad, I just need time to recover." "Then recover." "How?" "You took everything away." "No, Gideon. I stopped supplying it." His face tightened on the gate camera. "Same thing, only if you believed it was yours." He ended the call and walked back to the borrowed car he'd arrived in. I watched him leave without satisfaction. I had spent years building cushions beneath every mistake my son made. Now, each time he fell, he blamed me for removing the cushion instead of asking why he kept jumping. That evening, Lester called with another update. Gideon had contacted a real estate agent. "He's selling his house," Lester said. That caught my attention. Gideon had purchased the property 3 years earlier and spent heavily renovating it. "How much does he expect?" "About $500,000 in equity, if he can close quickly." For the first time since this began, Gideon was trying to raise money from something that actually belonged to him. I almost considered that progress. Then Lester added, "There's a problem with the renovations." I knew immediately what he meant. Gideon had ignored permits on several major changes, and years earlier I'd quietly paid contractors to correct the most dangerous work without forcing him to confront the full consequences. This time, I wasn't going to rescue the sale. Gideon finally had an asset of his own to fall back on, and he was about to discover what happened when Dad stopped cleaning up the problems hidden inside it. The problem with Gideon's house had been sitting behind fresh paint for almost 3 years. After buying it, he'd renovated aggressively, moving walls, converting part of the garage, and adding electrical work without completing several required permits. Back then, I'd warned him. He'd promised to fix everything later, and when contractors discovered dangerous wiring, I quietly paid to make it safe. What I couldn't do was erase the missing approvals. Now Gideon needed a fast sale, and expected nearly $500,000 in equity. For once, I didn't interfere. I simply refused to rescue him. During the buyer's inspection, questions surfaced about the renovations. The city reviewed the property, found work that hadn't been properly permitted, and issued restrictions until the problems could be inspected and corrected. The buyer walked away within 48 hours. Gideon called me immediately. "You reported the house?" "No." "Then how did they know?" "Because you're selling it. Buyers inspect things. You knew this would happen. I warned you 3 years ago." He went quiet, then said, "Can Lester fix it?" There it was again. Not, "How do I fix this? Can Dad's people fix this?" Lester isn't handling it. "Dad, I need that sale. Then work with the city and correct the problems." Gideon hung up. Without the sale, his last major source of quick cash disappeared. The following afternoon, he went to Lester's garage, looking for the 2 vehicles he'd once treated as his own. One had been purchased through my company, and the other carried expensive upgrades I'd paid for while Gideon used it. Lester met him outside. "Give me the keys," Gideon demanded. "To what?" "My cars." Lester calmly showed him the paperwork. Gideon's name wasn't where he expected it to be. The vehicles and several high-value components he'd assumed belonged to him had always been paid for and retained by entities I controlled. "My father gave those to me. He allowed you to use them." Gideon stared at the documents. That distinction was becoming the story of his entire life. Access wasn't ownership. Generosity wasn't entitlement. He called me from the garage. "Did you plan all of this?" "No, I planned my finances. You're only noticing because I stopped paying for yours. You left me with nothing. You're 34 years old, Gideon. You have your education, your experience, and the ability to work." He laughed bitterly. "That's easy to say when you have $18 million. It took me 35 years to build it." He didn't answer. Then I heard something unusual in his voice. Not anger. Exhaustion. Ainsley left. I sat forward. "What?" "Yesterday. She packed what she had at the hotel and went to her mother's." "Did she say why?" Gideon gave a hollow laugh. "She said she couldn't stay married to someone who'd destroyed her career and lost everything." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could have reminded him that Ainsley had pushed me. I could have told him she'd disappeared the moment the lifestyle disappeared. Instead, I asked, "Where are you staying tonight?" "I don't know." That was the first completely honest answer I'd heard from him since this began. Later, Lester told me Gideon stayed at the garage after the call. He sat on an overturned bucket beside the workbench, staring at the floor while mechanics finished their shifts around him. The man who demanded $5 million because he believed wealth was one investment away now had no luxury car, no quick house sale, no Ainsley beside him, and no father rushing in with a check. Lester offered him coffee. Gideon took it and whispered, "I thought all of it was mine." Lester replied, "That was the problem." Gideon stayed there almost an hour before leaving. I hoped hitting bottom might finally make him look upward. Instead, 2 mornings later, Lester arrived at my house carrying an official envelope. "Corbin, you need to read this." Inside was a notice from Adult Protective Services. Someone had reported that my recent head injury had caused cognitive decline, paranoia, and reckless financial behavior. The complainant claimed I was no longer capable of managing my $18 million estate and needed a family guardian. I didn't need to reach the final page to know whose name would be there. Gideon Miller was asking the state to declare his father incompetent and appoint himself to control my finances. I read the Adult Protective Services notice twice. Gideon wasn't asking me for money anymore. He was trying to convince the state that I was no longer competent enough to control it. According to the complaint, my head injury had caused sudden personality changes, paranoia, and irrational financial decisions. Cutting off Gideon's cards, vehicles, and access to my house were listed as evidence. Even my refusal to invest $5 million with Ellery Vance was described as proof that my judgment had deteriorated. Then I reached the request at the bottom. If I was found incapable of managing my affairs, Gideon wanted to be considered as my financial guardian. Lester watched me from across the table. He's trying to get through the door you wouldn't open. No, I said. He's trying to have someone declare that the door belongs to him. I wasn't angry. Mostly, I was disappointed that after losing nearly everything, my son had learned the wrong lesson. He still believed the problem wasn't his choices. It was that I controlled the money. 2 days later, an APS investigator named Raymond Okafor arrived. I welcomed him inside. I didn't argue with the allegations. I gave him permission to ask whatever he needed. Raymond asked the date, the president, details about my finances, and the circumstances surrounding my injury. Then he asked why I'd suddenly cut Gideon off. Because his wife shoved me into that counter and he left me bleeding on the floor. Do you have evidence? I handed him the preserved 47-second recording. He watched it without speaking. Then I gave him the medical report from that night. The scan showed no brain injury, but I had something stronger. 2 years earlier, when Lester and I strengthened the protections around my estate, my attorney had recommended a baseline neurological evaluation in case anyone ever questioned my capacity. I had completed it voluntarily. After Gideon's APS complaint, I returned for another independent assessment. 30 out of 30. No measurable cognitive decline. Raymond compared the two reports. You anticipated someone might challenge your capacity? I anticipated that $18 million could make people interested in my capacity. Next came the financial structure. My major assets weren't sitting in a checking account Gideon could simply gain access to. Much of the estate had already been placed under protections established while Carol was alive, with independent administration and clear documentation of my intentions. Even if Gideon convinced someone I needed help tomorrow, becoming my guardian wouldn't magically hand him $18 million. Raymond leaned back. Does your son know this? Apparently not. His investigation continued for several days. He spoke with Lester, reviewed my doctor's reports, and examined the timeline of Gideon's complaint. The timing was difficult to ignore. Gideon lost access to my financial support. His investment collapsed. His house sale failed. And then he reported that I had suddenly become incompetent. When Raymond returned, he closed his folder. Mr. Miller, I see no basis to conclude that you're unable to manage your affairs. I nodded. What happens now? The report will reflect that. Then he paused. There is another issue. Using an elder protection process as retaliation or to obtain financial control can raise serious concerns of its own. Lester looked at me. I knew what he was asking without words. We could push. We had the video, the timeline, and the financial motive. Gideon had finally created a document that could bring consequences far beyond losing my support. For several seconds, I considered it. Then I shook my head. Document everything accurately. That's enough. Lester waited until Raymond left before speaking. After everything he's done, you're still protecting him? No. I looked at the closed APS file. There's a difference between protecting Gideon and choosing not to destroy him. That distinction mattered. I was finished rescuing my son, but I wasn't interested in becoming someone who needed his suffering to feel whole. 3 nights later, at 11:14 p.m., the gate camera alerted me. I opened the feed and barely recognized the man standing outside. Gideon wore the same jacket he'd had for days. His face was unshaven. There was no borrowed car behind him, no Ainsley, no lawyer, and no demand for money. He simply stood beneath the gate light, staring toward the house. Then he pressed the intercom. I answered. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Finally, my 34-year-old son lowered his head and said, "Dad, I have nowhere left to go. Dad, I have nowhere left to go." I stared at Gideon through the gate camera. 3 weeks earlier, those words might have made me unlock the gate before he finished saying them. That night, I stayed where I was. "What happened to the hotel?" "I can't afford another night." "Ainsley?" "She won't answer me." Gideon wiped his face. "Please, Dad, just let me come home." Home. He still thought the solution was getting back inside the life he'd lost. "No, Gideon." His head lifted. "What?" "You're not moving back in. I'm your son. I know." "Then how can you leave me out here?" "I thought about the kitchen floor. The same way you left me when I asked you to call someone." He looked down. This time he didn't argue. "I'm sorry." I'd waited weeks to hear those words, but an apology made only after every other door closed wasn't enough to reopen mine. "What are you sorry for?" He struggled to answer. Finally he said, "For choosing Ainsley. For leaving you there. For thinking your money was supposed to become mine." That last sentence mattered. I told him to wait. 10 minutes later, I drove to the gate, carrying a small duffel bag. Gideon looked at it hopefully. "There's money in there?" "No." Inside were work boots, jeans, shirts, and a folded piece of paper. He opened it. "Lester Briggs, 7A, M, $15 an hour." Gideon stared at me. A job? An opportunity. At the garage? Sweeping floors, moving parts, cleaning tools. Whatever Lester needs. His face tightened. "I have a degree. Then you're qualified to arrive on time. $15 an hour won't fix my life." "No. But earning the first 15 might." Gideon looked toward the house beyond the gate. "And if I do this, can I come back?" "Don't do it for the house. Don't do it for my money. Do it because tomorrow morning you need somewhere to be." I handed him the bag. I didn't open the gate. At 6:52 the next morning, Lester texted me 2 words. He showed. I didn't respond. One day wasn't change, neither was 1 week. Gideon cleaned grease from floors, carried tires, and ate lunch with men who didn't care what watch he used to own. The first Friday, he received a paycheck smaller than dinners he'd once charged to my cards. He didn't ask me to supplement it. By the 3rd week, Lester moved him to inventory. By the 6th, Gideon was still arriving before 7. We spoke occasionally, but I never restored the cards, vehicles, or access to my house. Forgiveness and access were no longer the same thing. On my 61st birthday, Lester joined me at the attorney's office. The documents in front of me represented almost everything Carol and I had spent our lives building. Instead of leaving $18 million waiting for Gideon to inherit, I directed the estate toward a foundation supporting technical education, infrastructure training, and scholarships for young people who wanted trades but couldn't afford them. My house would eventually become a small learning center and public reading space. Gideon would not control the foundation, the house, or the fortune. When I told him, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he asked, "So I'm out of the inheritance?" Yes. 6 months earlier, that answer would have started a war. Gideon simply nodded. I figured. "Are you angry?" He looked down at his grease-stained hands. "I would have been." Then he looked at me. "But I think getting that money would have turned me back into the man who left you on the floor." For the first time in months, I saw my son, without entitlement, standing between us. I didn't know whether the change would last. Real change isn't proven by 1 apology or 6 good weeks. It's proven by what someone does when nobody is rescuing them anymore. Before leaving, Gideon stopped at the door. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "I'm sorry I made you believe losing me was the price of saying no." I swallowed hard. "And I'm sorry I spent so many years teaching you that my no didn't mean anything. We didn't fix 34 years in that room. We didn't need to." Some relationships aren't healed by returning to what they were. They're healed by refusing to repeat what broke them. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Darkness Awakens and tell me in the comments, if your own child left you bleeding over money, could you forgive them without giving them access to your life again? I loved my son before that night, and I loved him afterward. The difference was that I finally understood something Carol had tried to teach me years ago. Love can leave the porch light on without handing someone the keys.